All right, hey, U.S. history students, welcome in. We're going to introduce Unit 9 here, last unit of the year. And the focus here is on American life beyond World War II, 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. It's something of a survey. We're going to pick up the pace and move kind of rapidly through some of these ideas, but you can start to see some of the highlights of where we're going, sort of a focus on the creature comforts of American life returning and new styles of presidencies and the civil rights movement. And even in the top corner, we can see a hint at the Vietnam War and that sort of troubling conflict and the stories in there. But this first lesson here, 9.1, has to do with, let's say, the first 10 years following World War II and the transitions, the economic and cultural transitions out of wartime and into peacetime, kind of a grasping onto the creature comforts of American life and a being gripped by a certain set of fears and how that manifests itself in our culture. And our targets are about explaining our post-war prosperity and how that happened and how Americans imagined family life and what this Red Scare thing was about. So those are our pieces for today's lesson. Let's just jump right on in. This scene of tranquil domestic bliss of the dad and husband returning home from the war. This was repeated, 10 million times over following World War II. And that's something really beautiful, and it is to be celebrated. And Americans certainly did. And it's really wonderful. And this period of time is just marked in so many ways, guys, by people just saying, we've really kind of been through the ringer as a country. We've been through a depression. We've been through a crazy war, and now, golly, I would just love some predictability and some peace and some quiet and some normalcy and maybe some conformity. I just would like things to be predictable. I would like things to be the same, and I think that's understandable in a certain way. That emphasis on comfort and conformity would. There would be dysfunctional parts of it for sure, and we'll see some of that today. And I'd say there's plenty of Americans who did not feel like conforming necessarily. They said, well, we're not comfortable with the status quo, or the status quo does not work for us at all, and so we still have something to say about it. There's a younger class of teenagers that are looking to push out and rebel against some of this stuff. But, it's just as a funny period of Americans. The national mood is like, I've had enough adventure. I've had enough striving. I've had enough straining to get through the day or the week or the year. I would just like a nice backyard, a picnic table, and a quiet house to come home to. That's all I want, right? And I just want a nice beverage while I sit at home and a nice pot roast in the oven. And that's kind of the national mood, and that's what we're going to explore a little bit here today. There's certain transitions, there's certain things that are helping along this transition from a wartime economy into a peacetime economy. There's certain things that the government did to kind of set the table for this transition, because it's kind of like a train shifting tracks, right? Like we got to shift from wartime work into peacetime work. So there's some things the government did to help that along, and there's some things that just, the market, the free market did to help that along. In terms of what the government did, there was this law, this famous law, and it's really kind of a wonderful piece of legislation that's been very nifty and has paid for itself many times over. It's called the GI Bill. And the idea of the GI Bill is, look, soldiers get paid nothing. If you break it down into an hourly wage, they get paid pennies on the hour, and none of the work that they do is very safe. It's not OSHA compliant, let's put it that way. And so we should reward our soldiers, our veterans, in some additional way. And so what's offered here is a GI Veterans Bill. And so if you are a veteran, and at first it's for veterans of the war, but now it's for any veteran of the armed forces. The Armed Forces offers to pay for your college. Now, way back in 1946, that meant $500 a year. Sorry, gang, it's a little more expensive than that today. But at any rate, what this means is that all kinds of people coming home from the war who may or may not have had an economic plan for themselves now are offered this opportunity to go to college, go to a 2-year trade school, go to a 4-year university. In certain ways, that kind of relieves the pressure for everybody to have to find work right now, because that's, 1945, 46, there's a little bit of trick of like taking people out of the army and into the workforce. But beyond that, what it does, besides buying the economy a couple years to kind of move the people from the army into the workforce, what it does is it creates a better trained, a better skilled workforce for an information age economy rather than an industrial age economy. The GI Bill also makes it easier for veterans who would want to buy homes. And so what this bill does is it incentivizes young soldiers, men and women, like the image points out, to get an education, to buy a home, to start a family. These are good things to do. And the government is kind of incentivizing it, and all sorts of veterans, all sorts of people leaving the army who would otherwise never have had the means or the wherewithal to go to college suddenly are. And our workforce is being well equipped for it. And my own dad is part of that story. My dad, after he got out of the army, some of you remember that formational research paper. He ended up going to college, paid for by the GI Bill, and instead of being an electrician for his career, he ended up being an electrical engineer. And I assure you that the government made its money back by taxing his wage as an electrical engineer as opposed to his wage as an electrician. It's one of these things where it's like, as people make more and more money and the government's able to tax that pays off the costs that are involved. And as the whole economy floats and rises as a result, then that also pays all this off. So this is like a really cool bill and an example of a government doing a nifty move to help this transition out. But look, a lot of this, the success of the post-war American economy just has to do with basic ideas of supply and demand. It's not too hard to understand, right? Here's what we got. During the Great Depression, people wanted to buy something, but they had no jobs, right? So there was like, they would have bought something if they could, but they couldn't. There's just no economic activity happening. During the war years, people did have jobs, but rationing meant that they weren't able to buy stuff. Now, 1945, 46, 47, 48, now we have jobs, there are jobs available, rationing laws are being removed. And so what this is like a decade, or in some cases, like a decade and a half of pent up demand and of sort of artificially built up savings is available. And people are ready to live the comfortable life, to do the American consumerist thing, the thing that's near and dear to our hearts, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, maybe not yours, but everybody else's that we all like to do. And you get things like this ridiculous, poster, after total war can come total living. That's kind of insane, right? That's like, after Hiroshima, now at last we can go to the mall. It's sort of morally insane, but economically, this is the story of what's going on. And I'll also note, during these years, the businesses they're producing consumer goods. The public is just scooping the stuff up like crazy. And there is absolutely no international competition. No other countries in the world have like the manufacturing and the business ability or wherewithal in the post-war, in the stark post-war reality to produce this stuff. So all the money, all the businesses making money are our businesses. We're not competing with Japan or China or South Korea or European countries or anything else at that point. And so now what you have is a crazy positive economic cycle kicking in, and our economy hits this super high gear once again, like we hit in the industrial age, like we hit in the roaring 20s. In certain ways, we hit it during the wartime economy, the 40s, and now in like the 1950s, it really kicks off again. And we just lived a standard of living like no one else in the world. I mean, look at this. Americans ate 50% more food than Europeans. We owned 80% of the world's electrical goods and made 99% of the world's cars. Guys, this is an economic period like very, very few other. Now, it's, sometimes people say, well, these are the good old days, and if only we could go back to the economy of the 1950s, and what lessons can we learn from the 50s? And I'd say, if we think about this a little bit, guys, there's some circumstances where it's like, you just can't really reproduce the 1950s. The 50s has a particular set of circumstances that allowed this to happen, and it wouldn't necessarily otherwise take place. One aspect of 50s life that really becomes characteristic of the 50s life and life forever here on out, and life for many of you guys who live in, unless some of you are commuting in from Minneapolis, or you live way out in a farm, which is fine, a lot of you might. But for everyone else living somewhere between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and a farm, we got the suburbs. And the suburbs are an invention of post-war life. And so now this is a new highway system we're going to talk about in a moment. And with these highways, these broad roads that you can drive real fast on, and all these brand new comfortable automobiles that are being built, and Americans being able to get cheaper home loans and wanting this stuff and wanting the quiet life and wanting a family. There's just a demand for, can we sort of get some nice, cheap houses available? They don't have to be fancy. And a lot of these houses weren't, guys. For developers, it's like buy a cornfield, slap up a whole bunch of houses that kind of look nearly identical, put them on the market for an affordable price, and Americans will just keep buying these. And in many ways, they still do. A lot of you might live in a development like mine, where a lot of the houses were all built within 4 or 5 years of each other, and they all look pretty similar to each other. And like, I happen to live on a cul-de-sac, and it's quiet, and there's a park nearby, and there's good schools. And yeah, you can't really walk anywhere close. You have to get in your car and go places. But as long as you have a car, you can have your little small slice of heaven. And this idea of suburban living becomes part of the great American dream. The idea of the good life is kind of a suburban home and a white picket fence. And the suburbs go from not being a thing in 1940 to suddenly, a third of Americans lived in the suburbs. And it still is an enormous chunk of Americans live in what we'd call the suburbs. And developers are making a whole lot of money doing this. And this vision of a family, a white picket fence, there's a mall nearby, you've got a car that's beautiful and it feels like you're driving on a waterbed, and it looks like a jet engine, and there's even comfortable, convenient fast food nearby. The fast food phenomenon in the suburbs pops up. And so, for those of us here in Chaska with a Culver's and a McDonald's up the road and who live with our families, all of this seems it's starting to look kind of familiar, isn't it? It's like contemporary American life coming into focus in so many ways. And there's an interesting president who kind of matches the tone and the tenor of the times. His name is Dwight Eisenhower, and we know Eisenhower, of course. And Eisenhower he's a good fit for the 1950s. He's kind of a placid, calm approach, temperate. His general approach is, the language we've used in the past is like he was someone who wanted to turn down the thermostat, right? Rather than escalating things, he wanted to de-escalate things. You could basically plot him out as a moderate Republican. One of my favorite quotes from him, he wasn't someone who used a lot of hyperbole and hot language. He says at one point, he actually wrote this in his diary. He said, "Anger cannot win. It can't even think clearly." And I'd say amen to that. In domestic policy, he didn't try to undo the New Deal or anything like that. I think he and the Republican Party more or less kind of accepted the existence of the New Deal, but the plan was we're going to sort of slow down the rate of government growth. And he's also remembered for ending the Korean War. We recall that. So kind of a mild, temperate president for a kind of a milder decade in many ways. If Eisenhower is remembered for any domestic achievement, it's probably the signing and his pushing for what's called the highway system, the Interstate Highway Act. I forgot what year this was, but it's in the mid-1950s. And the idea of a highway is, what if we had massive roads where you'd never had to stop? They just had exits and no stop signs and no stop lights. And what if we sort of built a network of these roads across the country to connect it like never before and made it easier for Americans in these big, beautiful 1950s vehicles to travel from one part of the country to the next? And, because before, if you wanted to drive from Minnesota to California, for example, you had to drive on endless county roads through South Dakota or Nebraska or Colorado or Wyoming, one after the next. And now you can just sort of, hop on a couple interstates and hop on I-35. It'll take you all the way down to Texas. And you only have to stop to get, gas, and some beef jerky. And it's kind of an amazing phenomenon, right? And Eisenhower, this is a lot of money. We'll know it's a lot of money. Eisenhower justified it where he said, if we are ever invaded in a war, like by the Soviet Union, because the Cold War is on at this point, of course. If we are ever invaded in a war, we need the ability to mobilize and move the United States Army. So the specs of these of our interstates still, but the way they're built is they are designed at minimum. The width of the roads can fit two, I think it's Sherman or Abrams tanks, two American tanks side by side going down the road. They're built to be able to do that in case the U.S. Army ever has to mobilize on them. Now, thank God that's never happened. But it's an interesting piece that that's one of the ways that Eisenhower justified this and that the price tag was justified. Now, we'll say the price tag gets paid over many, many, many times because A, it increases economic activity as Americans move around, and B, the trucking industry blows up. And so it just becomes easier to move stuff via truck across the country. That's another economic sort of stimulating effect. And one more reason why the economy just really takes off during that period of time. So the highways are amazing. And our life is kind of unimaginable without them. I mean, think about what it would be like without 212 or I-35, I-94, I-90 here in Minnesota. Life is just kind of unimaginable in America without it. And we sort of thank the Eisenhower years for that. Inside all those little suburban homes was sometimes a lot of domestic bliss, a lot of creature comforts, televisions, vacuum cleaners, like you see here. Also kind of a lot of strange pressures. There's a lot of kind of social norms in the 1950s that are kind of funny. There's just a sense like Americans, again, are in this mood. I just want some peace and quiet to get me through, the next 10 years, because Lord knows the previous 15 years was kind of a living hell, and I just want something that's kind of nice and predictable and quiet and pleasant. Pleasantness is an emphasis in 1950s domestic life. And gender norms that are sometimes productive, sometimes helpful, sometimes push people in positive ways, and sometimes they were dysfunctional. It's like, for example, for men were expected to be breadwinners. You're supposed to be able to make money. You're supposed to be a company man, which means you get a job at a company right after college or right out of school, and you go to work for them and you sort of mind your P's and Q's and you work your way up the corporate ladder and you stay with that company for years and years and years, and you wear your gray flannel suit to work every day. And at the end of and you keep sort of making a little bit more money every year. And at the end of the road, they'll give you a nice watch upon your retirement. And it says, thank you for being, an ultimate compliment, a company man. And a company man means you're a loyal man. And you stayed loyal to that company and you worked for that company. And for men also during these years, there's like this sort of dysfunction of, you work hard all day, you get home, you tussle the kid's hair a little bit, and you say, hey, Billy, how was the day today? And he goes, good, I passed the test. And you go, great. And that's the end of your parenting work for the day. And then when the hard thoughts or the sad thoughts about the war pop in your brain, or the things that you can't talk to other people about because it's too dark and too despairing, that's when the alcohol comes in, or that's where you stuff those feelings deep down and you just sort of become an emotional stoic and you don't talk to anyone about that ever. That's like the sort of classic mid-century American male stereotype and expectation that men were expected to live up to. For women, it's like, look, women, ladies, you are expected to be devoted to your man. Working outside the home is fine when you're 18, 19, 20, 21. Maybe even when you first get married. You could continue to be a school teacher, a nurse, a secretary, something like that. But once you have kids, you're done working. That's the end of that. And even once you are married, you have to know that if you're continuing to work, you're kind of embarrassing your husband a little bit socially. And why would you want to embarrass your husband? Better to stay home and make for a pleasant home life and home environment for your husband. Maybe by, like it has here, doing your hair and putting on your makeup and putting on some high heels and vacuuming the carpet for a little bit. right? And you diligently tend to the children. Raising the children is your job, and you kind of present the children to the husband, and try in general to make your husband's life as stress-free as you can possibly make it at home. And you will get married. Everybody will get married. 90% of eligible adults will get married. That number today is like 55%. And you will not get divorced. I mean, you'll get divorced if you want everybody to talk about you getting divorced and you want to stop getting invited to stuff. But you probably don't want that to happen, right? So you will get married and you will stay married. For some people, this encouraged, virtuous life choices. For some other folks, it felt like a straitjacket, or they felt perpetually unable to meet those kind of standards of gleaming, pleasant perfection. It's strange, right? Like 50s nuclear family ideals and the expectation that things should be comfortable and pleasant and nice because it's been uncomfortable and unpleasant for too long, and we need to just make it be nice. There's nothing wrong with pleasantness and niceness. Lord knows I enjoy it as much as anybody. It got a little weird sometimes in the 1950s. Another thing that got a little weird, I'm going to introduce this and we'll watch a video to talk about it, is the Red Scare. Like this sort of fear that gripped Americans that like, what if we lose our country to the communists? What if the expansion of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe? What if the expansion of communism into China and North Korea? What if there are communists here in our midst who are kind of weakening our country here from within? And that fear gave way to some paranoia. And the complicated piece that you have to start with is you have to say that fear is not unfounded. There were real problems. There were real spies. The Rosenbergs were spies. Klaus Fuchs was a spy. Alger Hiss was a spy. These were real spies who did like damage America. They gave away atomic secrets to the Soviets. That's a real thing. But the weird part that we did, and we do this from time to time, we Americans, it's kind of a curse for us, is we take this real legitimate problem or this fear and then we overreact to it. Or we say, because this fear is so bad, then we don't have time to sort of protect people's political freedoms. We don't have time for the Bill of Rights, right? We gotta hammer away at this like really, really bad thing. And the Red Scare is this phenomenon where we felt like, sometimes it was personal Americans, like, I wonder if they're a communist. Are they a communist? Like that gets weird. Companies making you sign loyalty pledges to America, kind of odd. Or our own government sort of trying to sniff out and hunt down people who might not be sufficiently loyal to the United States or who might have sympathies with the Soviet Union, right? And in Congress, I mean, they love to go after Hollywood, like movie stars and movie producers and writers who, of course, are liberal. I mean, shocker, Hollywood is liberal. That's like, it's some things never change, right? But like, it's one thing to be a liberal, right? That's fine. That's normal. That's totally normal, right? It's another thing to say, you're liberal, but are you a communist? You're liberal, but are you really an American, right? Are you really loyal to us and what we believe? And we take all these steps to like, seek out our associates. And what about your sister? She attended this meeting one time. And what about your friend that you were a roommate with? He subscribed to like a newsletter that's kind of has some marginal beliefs on it. What's that about? Or we add things like we put in the phrase under God into the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. And we add the under God to say we are America, right? Where we believe in God, unlike the godless communists, right? And so we insert language like that to try to say, like we're trying to kind of ferret out and root out communism. And it becomes part of the strange cultural flavor of the 1950s. And it's one thing if it's just kind of in the air, but then you add in a particular guy, like the Pied Piper of the Red Scare, the Pied Piper of the leader of the pack in terms of going way overboard in this sort of pursuit of communists in our midst is a guy named Joseph McCarthy. You'll watch a video about him, but he's basically like a no-name Republican senator. He's going nowhere. He's also from Wisconsin, for crying out loud. And he just announces, more or less randomly one day, I hold in my hand a list of 205 communists that I've uncovered in the United States State Department. And I need to get to the bottom of this, America. And all kinds of Americans are like, what? Like there's hundreds of communists working in the United States government? And he says, yes, there are, ladies and gentlemen, and we are going to sort of subpoena them, and we're going to bring them to Congress, and we're going to make them testify. And it's sort of years of these testimonies and these congressional committees, and it is a mess, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to watch a video that talks about that. It's a stinking mess that we get in this road of fear. So you'll be watching that video. Anyway, that's my introduction to this period of time, right? Conformity, comfort, and fears. Economically, things are great. Culturally, things are pleasant, but there's also dysfunctional stuff going on below the surface. We'll look at this question later on. So anyway, that's all. Thank you guys so much for your work today, and we'll be in touch. Take care. Bye.